This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I interview interesting people from all different backgrounds about their paths towards peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 249 of Food Psych, the season 7 finale. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fat activist, author, speaker, and podcaster Victoria Welsby for her second appearance on the show. We discuss the intersection of fat phobia and healthism, why all weight loss advice is a form of weight stigma, the moralization of different health conditions, the role of thin allies in fat activism, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. But first, just a reminder that we're going on summer hiatus for the month of August, as we've been doing pretty much every year for the past 7+ years I've been making this podcast, to recharge and plan for the next season, and also to work on some other cool creative projects. So for the next month, we'll be reposting fan favorite episodes from our archives, and then we'll be back on September 7th with the season 8 premiere. And now, instead of me answering this week's listener question, as usual, I've hired a co-host for this segment to provide her perspective. This is a new feature that I mentioned a few weeks ago, which we're launching as a way to help create opportunities for people with less dominant identities to be correspondents for the podcast. So going forward, I'll still be answering some of your questions, and I'll also be inviting co-hosts to answer others. The first co-host in this series is someone who's been on my team for years, been a previous guest on the pod, and helped me pilot test this new guest hosting feature. She's also instrumental in creating the show notes for each episode and a lot of the social media content as well. And if you've ever listened to the credits at the end of the show, if you make it that far, you've heard her name. I'm, of course, talking about Vincci Tsui, and she has a great Q&A that I'll play for you now in a segment that we're now calling Ask Food Psych.
Hi, my name is Vincci Tsui. I'm a registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor based in Calgary, Canada, the traditional territories of the peoples of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot First Nation tribes of Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations tribes of Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. I'm also the Community and Content Associate here at Food Psych, so if you're part of the Intuitive Eating Fundamentals or Master Your Anti-Diet Message courses, you've probably met me there, and you can hear more of my story on episode 176 of the podcast as well. So that's enough about me, and on to this week's question, which comes from Lee, who writes, Hi, Christy. I recently discovered your podcast and love it. I have been doing restricting binging most of my life, believing that the binges were lack of self-control and now realizing that they were caused by my restrictions. I also completely overexercised for years and felt that I worked so hard I should be thinner. My weight hasn't changed in years no matter what I do. I've backed off restrictions with food and movement and started doing what exercise I'm in the mood for rather than adhering to strict plans. My weight still hasn't changed, but I'm not putting pressure on myself anymore, and I'm enjoying food and exercise for pleasure rather than obligation. I can't wrap my head around some parts of your message. It seems, quote unquote, non-diet is the answer for people who have been dieting or restricting, and some bodies are naturally bigger and some are smaller. But what about people who make no attempts to eat healthy foods and suffer health consequences not caused by hormones of restriction or binging cycles? I'm an ER nurse and care for many patients who make no attempts at dieting and have terrible health problems caused by unhealthy lifestyle habits. As an example, my ex did nothing to support his health and suffered a heart attack by age 42. Definitely not caused by diet culture, as he made no attempts to alter his diet even after his heart attack. What recommendations are made for health? I know you say that there is no moral obligation to be healthy, but this becomes costly to the healthcare system. Thank you in advance, and I apologize for any stigmatizing language. So thanks, Lee, for this question. And before I answer, I will use the same disclaimer that Christy uses, that my answer is for informational and educational purposes only and are not a substitute for medical or mental health advice, nor does it constitute a practitioner-client relationship. So I want to start off by saying thank you as an ER nurse for your service during the COVID-19 pandemic. As a fellow healthcare practitioner, as a dietitian myself, I totally empathize with your concerns around health. And I'm sure many of us go into this field because health and maybe even a healthy lifestyle are things that we value. And while it's true that certain lifestyle behaviors might increase or decrease our risk of certain health outcomes, outside of, say, like smoking and lung cancer, there are really no proven causal relationships between lifestyle and chronic disease. But at the same time, like, this is what we're taught in school, not just in school, but also just in our whole culture and diet culture, the wellness diet. It's kind of conditioned us to believe that our health is a direct result of our behaviors. So it makes sense that, like, you're kind of feeling like, oh, like my ex had a heart attack because he was unhealthy. It makes sense that we believe that because that's what we're conditioned to believe. But, as you might have heard Christy share on this podcast before, our lifestyle behaviors really only account for a small percentage, like maybe 20 to 30% of our health outcomes. Genetics and other non-modifiable risk factors maybe make up about another small percentage. But really the biggest contributor to health disparities in a population are the social determinants of health. So what that means might be socioeconomic status, education, employment, access to healthcare and other amenities like safe food, safe places to engage in movement. And of course, stigma is another social determinant of health as well. So all of those things actually have a greater impact on our health than the individual health outcomes. And listening to these, you can probably see that they also influence our ability to engage in quote unquote healthy habits in the first place. So even though on the surface it might seem like a person's habits are what are causing their health outcomes, the true cause is probably a lot more complicated. And I don't think we can ever really design a study or a diagnostic tool to really figure out what that cause is. And the cause doesn't really matter because at the end of the day, we still need to care for that person as a healthcare practitioner. So it's not about, oh, like if you have this disease because of this, then we are going to take care of you, but not if you do that. Like that's healthist and ableist. And so we really need to move away, I think, from what is causing it. But circling back to your question of what recommendations are made for health, first, it sounds like even in your experience, that work to heal your relationship with food and your body has been beneficial for your own health and well-being. So we shouldn't discount that as a part of healthcare. But I know what you're getting at. I know you're trying to say kind of like what healthy foods should people be eating, like quote unquote, should people be eating, or what exercise, quote unquote, should people be doing. And while the principles of intuitive eating aren't meant to be done in order, there's a reason why joyful movement and gentle nutrition are the last things, because it can be so easy to turn some of these recommendations into a diet. So even in your question, I noticed that you mentioned that people who make quote unquote no attempts to eat healthy foods or quote unquote no attempts at dieting can go on to struggle with health consequences. So it sounds like even for you, there might still be some conflation between dieting, health, and nutrition there that might need some disentangling. But in my practice, like when folks do reach a point where they are ready to consider gentle nutrition, I like to think of the evidence as a starting point for exploration rather than an endpoint. So, for example, instead of saying eating less of this food would help with this condition, I might say, the evidence shows, like when we look at lots of people with lots of different lifestyles, that maybe eating less of this food or more of this food could help with this condition. Would you be interested in seeing if that's the case for you? And if so, how would that look like in your life? And of course, like as you were saying earlier, individual change can only do so much. And so, in addition to these individual changes that I'm helping my clients make, it's also important to highlight some of the larger systems that are impacting health, and also how like I can use my privilege, or maybe if my client is also in a position to advocate for some of these changes that we would like to see in these systems. So I hope this answers your question. And if not, you can definitely connect with me via my website, vincitsui.com. So my name is not spelled how it's pronounced. So it's VINCCITSUI.com, or on social media. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook at VinciRD. So that's VINCCIRD. And if you're a Canadian dietitian, I'm also the founder of Weight Inclusive Dietitians in Canada, which is a community offering monthly webinars and peer support roundtables that I'm hoping to eventually expand to include other helping professionals too, including nurses. So for more info, just head to my website at vincijoy.com and click on For Dietitians, but I'm hoping to give it its own URL soon.
Thanks, Vincci, for that great answer. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, either by me or by one of my upcoming co-hosts, who are primarily going to be folks who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me any question you want and have me answer it much more quickly, often with the help of Vincci as well, you can join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. The course has a monthly Q&A podcast just for course participants, where you get to ask your own questions every month and have me answer them, and with Vinci's input as well. And you get to listen to hundreds of answers I've given to other participants already too, so that you can work through the nuances of intuitive eating and really put it into practice in your own life. The course also has 13 modules of audio and written content where I walk you through the principles of intuitive eating, plus a private community forum just for course participants, so that you can have daily guidance from me and my team, as well as hundreds of other great people who are on this anti-diet path with you. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold, and audiobooks too. And I read the audiobook myself, which was very fun. The book is a really great companion to this podcast because it goes into depth about a lot of the stuff we talk about here: diet culture, the ways that it harms us, the scientific evidence against it. And there are lots of references and resources to help you build that foundation of awareness and analysis and help you make the case for the anti-diet paradigm to people in your life. The book also lays out the foundation of intuitive eating and helps you start making peace with food and your body wherever you are right now. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it now. That's christyharrison.com/book. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Victoria Welsby, which was recorded before the COVID-19 pandemic. So, Victoria, welcome back to the show. I'm so excited to talk with you again.
I am so excited to be here. It's been 2 years since we've talked, so we need to catch up.
Oh, seriously. I can't believe it's been 2 years. Your last episode was amazing, and people should definitely go check it out. And of course, I didn't write down the episode number, but I think it was like 160 something in July of 2018. So we'll definitely put a link to that in the show notes so people can hear your story and your background and all of that great stuff. But you've been up to a lot in the last 2 years since we spoke. So catch us up on everything that's been going on.
Yeah, since that episode, I I don't think my TEDx talk was out. Maybe it was, but maybe it wasn't online, but I had a TEDx talk. My book came out called Fierce Fatty. Audio version of that came out. I was in a 2-part BBC documentary. I've been prancing around in my bikini, sharing my fat for the world to see, just the usual fattylicious stuff, being busy doing that stuff.
And you started your podcast as well.
Oh, yeah. See?
Also that.
I forget how awesome I am. Oh my gosh. Yeah, podcast too.
Yeah, I want to hear about all of it. I am so curious to dive in first to talking about the documentary because that sounds bananas. Like, tell us what the premise of this was and what it was like.
Yeah, so last year I was approached by a production company that works for the BBC because they'd seen my TEDx talk and they were making a program about the realities of being fat, and they wanted to hear voices from fat people who liked being fat people in the fat positive movement, and also voices of people who didn't like being fat and people who were somewhere in the middle. And so we all lived together in a house, in a gorgeous house in Oxfordshire in the UK for 10 days. There was 9 of us over the summer in 2019, and the show came out in November. And it was an experience. It was really an experience living in a house with people who were very certain about the idea that it is bad to be fat and being fat means that you're about to die, and all of these different attitudes that I had so long ago removed myself from. So it was challenging, to say the least.
Oh, I bet it's like going back into the diet culture, belly the beast.
Yeah, it was like Twilight Zone or something. And it was like going back in time and hearing these beliefs and attitudes that to me now feel so dated. But some of the people in the house had positions of authority in the real world. And so one of them is the director of a O-word charity in the UK. And we'd be directly talking to British Parliament. So knowing that someone who is so fat phobic is advocating for fat people, but advocating for the erasure of fat people was maddening and really frustrating for me, because I wanted to be like, no, just leave the fatties alone. Stop trying to, get rid of us. We're pretty cool.
How much interaction did you have with that person?
Quite a lot, honestly. It was, half of the house was fat phobic and the other half was fat positive. So pretty much from the moment that we woke up, we were mic'd up, cameras on, to the end of the day, like 11 o'clock at night. And all we were doing during that time was either having discussions or doing activities in relation to fat positivity or in relation to educating us fatties about how we're going to die any second now. So it was really interesting because obviously I'm super fat positive and I have no doubts in my mind that it's okay to be fat. And after spending 10 days with people who were so, had the opposite opinion and felt that they were also so right in their opinion, it made me really understand and go back to that place where Victoria was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, where there was some doubt or there was some deep loathing, and really understanding the place where a lot of people who are maybe listening to the show right now are coming from and how difficult that is. And so that was a really powerful learning for me.
I bet. Yeah, it sort of puts you in contact with that older version of yourself, like previous version of yourself.
Yeah.
How did you navigate that? Like, did it strike up any doubts in your own mind to be sort of like, did it feel triggering to you to be around that? Or did you have enough mental boundaries that it sort of didn't break through?
So 90% of it, I was sassy and standing up for fatties. And I was the most vocal person in the house in regards to, when they would say, oh, hey, we should do stomach amputation surgery on children. And, I'd be the one who'd be like, maybe not. Maybe not a great idea. And so I was also the one who would be challenged the most because of that. And so that was difficult because it becomes exhausting, which is the day-to-day life of a fatty. Obviously, this is, the more extreme version. But also, there was one thing that made me think, oh, maybe I should change my view on this. And that was the idea of fat being a disease. And so this person who was the director of this charity was saying that fat should be a disease because if it is classified as a disease, then fat people would get more funding and more access to things like mental health services and that type of thing. So my response to fat as a disease is, oh, hell no, it's not a disease. Fat bodies they're not disease. It's just a normal way of having a body. It's like saying tall bodies should be classed as a disease. And so I was thinking, maybe if it is classed as a disease, then fat people will get more support. And then that was my maybe. But then as soon as I came out of the house, I did more research and worked out why that is not appropriate at all, because it's increasing the stigmatization of fat bodies and saying there's something wrong with fat bodies. And yeah, it's great if fat people can get some more, support in regards to navigating stigma. But really what that's probably going to happen is that we're going to have more funding for surgeries and more funding for diets, which are obviously bullshit. And so that was my only thing where I was like, but then I was like, no, it's bullshit. No, thanks.
Right. Yeah. Like when an O-word charity director says, oh, well, we could get more money for people's health or for people's mental well-being. It's like, actually, that's code for more money for the O-word side of things to eradicate fat people and help people's mental health while getting them to lose weight because somehow that's compatible. It's like, no.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And so I had moments where oh yeah, that could be a good idea. And it just goes to show when you're surrounded by fat phobia, how you're worn down by it. And I preach this stuff and still I was worn down after 10 days. And so 10 days was probably representative of 6 months or a year in the life of someone who's surrounded by fat phobes. So how hard is it to someone who is not in fat acceptance to be able to say, hang on a minute, this doesn't sound quite right. It's impossible almost, it feels like.
Yeah, I think this is why this is such a cultural issue and not just an individual one, because even the most strident fat liberation activist can still be worn down by something like that. That indicates what a tall order it is for anyone living in this culture. And it can't be on the individual. It can't be just on all of us to resist that, on fat people to constantly be the ones sticking up for themselves and resisting and pushing back, because that is exhausting and that's not anyone's responsibility. That's definitely something you can do to advocate for yourself and help make the world a little safer for you in the moment. But continuing to have to do that again and again always is going to wear you down. I don't think there's anyone who wouldn't be exhausted by that over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And as well, this whole thing really highlighted how slippery diet culture can be and how tricky it can be. And, we all know about the new faces of diet culture and thinking about all the different ways of, we should eat more healthy and how that healthy eating message is obviously very problematic, but, something that seems innocent to the lay person who's not very familiar with diet culture and fat phobia could just be another spiral into diet culture when you think, oh, I'm just going to teach my kid how to eat healthily. And then all of a sudden it's, doing, terrible things for your brain and your body and stuff because you're learning all this problematic diet culture-y, fat phobia bullshit.
And it really is so insidious, right? Because I think the fat phobes think they're doing something good. They think they're helping people, quote unquote, be healthy. And I think that's why it's so tricky and hard to push back on, is that people have good intentions. They just don't understand how bigoted they really are. I don't think I think that most people who are fat phobic and working in this fat phobic space of quote unquote O-word prevention, I don't think that they think of themselves as bigoted people. I don't think they think of themselves as discriminating against anyone. And, I think if you point that out to them, they're often horrified and defensive and, deny that it is happening. But I think that really is what's happening. But it's so insidious. It's so under the guise of, we're just trying to help you. We're just trying to make your life better and easier because, the reality is life really is hard. The higher you go up the weight spectrum, it gets harder because of the fat phobia and discrimination you face in the world. So selling the solution as like, we're going to help you get healthier and therefore escape all these problems that you've experienced in the world as a side effect of your body size. It's like, yeah, people want that. And people think that that is the solution. That's what's going to do it for them.
And for someone who can kind of spot that more easily, it's really infuriating. Like, so for example, in the House, we had 2 members of Parliament come in. I don't know what the American version of it. Senators? Is that a thing?
Yeah, it's either senators or representatives because we have 2 houses. I forget. And that you all have, what is the other house? It's like House of Lords.
Oh, yes.
I think House of Lords might be our Senate and Parliament is representatives.
Okay. So these members of Parliament were people who represent the people sort of thing. And so they came to the House to talk to us about what we want as fat people. And they came across as very pleased with themselves. Both of them were straight-sized people, that they were coming to help us poor fatties, to stop us being fat. And when some of us who were the fat positive people spoke up and said, oh, hey, let's stop the stigma, or let's, stop all of this diet bullshit, they were really confused as to like, what? Like, what? Isn't, helping fat people just helping them become thin people? And that idea that maybe that wasn't the right way to go about it was met with absolutely no way, they are not wrong. And fat people, we are so sick. This is the impression I got, that we are so sick, we don't know what's good for us. And they, as the thin people in a position of authority, were going to help us and save us despite ourselves. And even though we just want to be fat and be terrible and be, a drain on the system and all that type of stuff, they were good people and they were sticking up for us, even though we were quote unquote bad. I was just like, And one of them started speaking to me saying, oh, it's so great what you're doing for fat people, because she thought that I was helping fat people become less fat. And I was like, I was like, wow, yeah, that's cool that you think it's great. And she's like, so how can we make fat people less fat? She said it in a different way. And I was like, no, I think it's, fat. It's okay for fat people to be fat. And she literally, her face dropped and she was like, okay, well, nice talking to you. Bye. she just walked away. And I was like, okay, see you later. Yeah. So there was no openness to the idea that fat people needed anything apart from being erased from our society. Anything else was just fat people being ridiculous and hurting themselves. And yeah, so that was sad.
And that makes me think, I think about this a lot when I hear stories like this, that like, we really need more and more and more scientific research that gets at the nuances of this, that looks at, because there's this huge body of research now on weight stigma and its harmful effects. And even like the fat phobic people who are trying to eradicate fatness and think they're doing the right thing with that, they agree, quote unquote, they agree that weight stigma is a problem. They're like, we're on the same page about this. We're all, we all are fighting weight stigma. Like there's no conflict here, right? Like whenever I bring up weight stigma with people on that side, I think that's kind of the message that I get. I've done a couple of debates for dietitians organizations with a quote unquote O-word doctor. And that's been his response, is like, you just spent half your presentation talking about weight stigma. And like, we agree that weight stigma is bad. There's no debate here. And I think that's where we could really use, there already is science about this, but we could use a lot more getting at the nuances of this and showing that any form of telling fat people that their bodies should be less fat is weight stigma. Any way in which you try to advocate for weight loss is actually weight stigma. And there's research on this, in various ways showing that even subtle levels of weight stigma increase people's levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, which could be, a mechanism by which weight stigma negatively impacts the body, as we see that it does. There's also research showing that framing quote unquote O-word as an epidemic is harmful and increases weight stigma in the people who read those reports, and that including an anti-weight stigma message along with the message that obesity, quote unquote, is bad for you and is a matter of personal responsibility to change and is a drain on the healthcare system, like those messages actually increase people's levels of weight stigma. There is good evidence out there for that, but I think there needs to be more so that we can build this incontrovertible base of evidence to say, look, what you're doing is actually harmful. And so, if there's any researchers out there listening, I feel like that is such a fruitful and important area of research to operationalize how telling someone that their body size is wrong in any way, shape, or form, even if it's in quote unquote compassionate way, is actually harmful and actually weight stigmatizing. Because I think if we had that evidence, and members of parliament and doctors and researchers all want to be evidence-based and up on the latest science. And so I think if we could have, a bigger body of science to really point to and say, this is bad, we need to change the way that our system is practicing with regard to people in larger bodies, I think that would have a big effect.
Yeah, and exactly what you said, when people are saying in a compassionate way, you should lose weight, they think that that is reducing stigma when it is perpetuating stigma, and it's not in the way that you say it, and it's not in the fact that you're nice to fat people and not blaming fat people. Yes, you should be nice to fat people and not blame fat people, but also you should just support fat people if they want to engage in healthful behaviors or not, and do what they want with their body and not prescribe weight loss. And yeah, I think that just like you say, the prescription of weight loss is weight stigma. It is fat phobia. And doctors think that they're being nice by not being complete knob. And so that means that I'm not perpetuating weight stigma because I'm not a massive knob. I'm just a bit of a knob by prescribing weight loss. No.
It's still stigmatizing. Right. Because I feel like when you hear that stuff, right, your response, I'm sure, is there's obviously a sense in which you recognize that your body is being made the enemy, is being made wrong.
Yeah. And hearing, as a fat person, just hearing, even if it's kind, that you should change who you are as a fundamental being is violence. Even if it's said with a smile and a pat on the knee and with a gentle voice, it's still violence. And there's no way that we can sugarcoat that.
Yeah, I think pointing out the violence of that, I think, is really key, because no one who is a healthcare provider or a public servant of any kind probably thinks that they are doing harm or wants to do harm. I think we all kind of get into this work because we want to help. But if we can see the unintended consequences of what we're doing, I hope that could help move the needle.
I think so. You know what? I think so because my mum is a retired nurse, and she used to be, as we all have been, had a lot of fat phobic beliefs. And the way now that, I do this work, her beliefs have changed, which is incredible. And obviously that's not something that I tried to push, but it just happened. Anyway, and so now the way that she talks, and she says, oh my God, I can't believe some of the things that I used to say to my patients, and how me saying don't do this or don't do that or your body weight is wrong, how that negatively impacted them, how that actively hurt them. And I feel terrible about it. And I think all it really takes is someone saying, hey, this is hurting people and this is having the opposite effect of what you're trying to achieve. And I think most people, as long as they're not, a sociopath or something, is going to say, oh, shit, well, maybe I should stop doing that, as long as, you can show the evidence and all that type of stuff. Because, yeah, like you say, hopefully most people don't want to do harm. And once the education is there to show how harmful this stuff is, then I believe it's going to change. In 10 years, we're going to look back and be like, oh my God, I can't believe we used to do this and say that. And in 20 years, it'll be even further.
Oh, yes. I have so much hope for that as well. Even if it's not entirely eradicated in our lifetime, that at least more and more healthcare professionals will get it and will see the error of their ways. And that's really cool to hear about your mom too. I'm sure she probably had some resistance to it at first. So there was a lot of education that had to happen before she could break through to that. But
yeah, and I didn't, the thing is with the people around me is I didn't want to be like, hey, everybody, listen to what I've got to say. And it was a kind of I just rubbed off on her. And I think people, hopefully our family, love us and want to understand us and want to understand what's going on in our world. And as a fat person, she's straight size, how life could be different. And she could see that, like if we went shopping and I'd be like, nothing for me to wear in here, and, little things like that. So it was lovely. And I know that's not the case for everyone. A lot of times family members are very difficult to deal with, and luckily things worked out well for me. So yay, my mum.
Yeah. Yeah. Not every family member is that receptive, I think, but it's pretty awesome when they are.
Yeah. And I guess when you're doing it for your job and for years and years and years, you've been saying the same thing, then hopefully they might come around.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And if you're, just kind of doing it in a way that's gradual but sustained, rather than having those big debates. Because I think it is so tempting when we're first getting into this work to be like, did you know? And sort of lecture everyone around us. I think I've had moments like that anyway with family members where I'm like, I just want to launch into a whole tirade. But I think, sometimes that's going to be counterproductive. And the better approach for long-term change is maybe to do it more gradually and plant seeds. And of course, you have to stand up for yourself in moments of utter fat phobia where you're being hurt. But I think in time, sometimes people are able to come around more if it is gradual, if you're patient with them.
Yeah, honestly, I really believe that's true, because my mum lives in a different country. And so she wouldn't have got those rants that I definitely would have gone on if she was closer to me, of being like, oh my God, I can't believe this. When we first discover this stuff and you're just like, I'm so angry, or something happens. So she would have, but luckily because of distance, she didn't get those tirades from me. So maybe that's why. And a lot of people who did get those tirades, because, I was angry, and it's hard to understand when someone is like, oh, did you know that you're, doing this and that, and it's blah, blah, blah. And it's difficult to connect with someone when they're in that place. But of course, it's absolutely okay to be really fucking mad about the fact that you've been duped by diet culture for your whole life. So be angry as well. It's good.
Right. Yeah. Anger in the face of injustice is totally understandable and valuable and important. And sometimes it's hard for people to hear you from that place too. So there's kind of a delicate dance that has to happen.
Yeah, totally. And like you say, when people are still being aggressively fat phobic in your life, then that's a whole other beast and thing that you have to deal with as well. So yeah, so I know I've had to deal with that, and sometimes it's gone well and sometimes not so well. So, we're all humans.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we talked about in our last episode too, setting boundaries with those people is super important. Setting boundaries with the people who are aggressively fat phobic and harming you is a way to care for yourself. It's a form of self-care.
Yeah. And oh God, I just love that last episode talking about boundaries. I fucking love boundaries. They're just so juicy. Yeah. And it just helps people build a better relationship with you. And so using my mum as an example again, the ways in which I set boundaries were, just little things. So for example, whenever she would mention fat as a negative, I would just say, oh, hey, can you not mention fat as a negative? And she'd be like, oh, okay. And then something else might slip out. And again, it would be a gentle, can you not mention fat as a negative? And it was another learning opportunity. And I remember the last time I was trying on a dress for a wedding, and I said, oh, which one do you like better, this one or this one? And she said, well, that one, your bum looks kind of big. And immediately I was like, oh, it does? Amazing. I love it. Isn't it great to have a fat bum? And then afterwards, I said, oh, hey, did you notice how I said that? It's because you framed fat as a negative. And it was kind of a slow breaking down of how some things are problematic, even though it wasn't like, fuck you, I hate you, you fat idiot or whatever. It wasn't like that. It was a gentle fat phobia. And she hasn't said anything like that since. And that's been, 4 years ago. And it only took maybe 3 or 4 different times of saying, hey, can you not do that thing? And that's the way it turned out, which is beautiful. And not saying that that's the way it's always going to turn out, because everyone's different, but it can be done. And it can be relatively easy. Like I would have thought with someone who has had certain views all of their life, to change the way they talk would be very, very difficult. But It happened. It's amazing.
I mean, it sounds like she's particularly sensitive, maybe, and listening to what you have to say. And obviously, she's your mom, so she loves you and she wants to have a good relationship with you. And I feel like that goes a long way too, when there's that love there and you want to do right by a person.
Yeah, yeah. And I think as well, the way that you frame it, versus you are a bad person for saying that thing. I can't believe you said that. Why are you doing that? Why do you hate me? Why do you hate me so much? Versus a request that kind of makes it easier. Like, can you not do that thing? So lucky for me, things turned out well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. I want to talk a little bit more about fat phobia and healthism, because I know that's something that we both are so interested in. And that kind of came up a little bit in your experience in the house, it sounds like, with the people who saw themselves as the health saviors and maybe were in positions of authority regarding health, making this sort of argument like, well, if you're fat, you're unhealthy, and unhealthy equals bad, and sort of couching that stigma in healthist beliefs and rhetoric. What's been your experience with that, with, the way that healthism and fat phobia are intersecting these days?
Yeah. So in the house, it was very interesting because the fat people who didn't want to be fat thought that fat people who thought it's okay to be fat also reveled in being unhealthy. And that idea is so fucked up on so many different levels. And one of the guys who was in the process of losing weight because he had a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. And so he had started moving his body more and changed his diet, and he happened to have lost weight. So he was like, oh man, I was so terrible before when I was fat and I didn't care about being fat and I was so lazy and I used to eat anything and all this type of stuff. And I asked him, I said, do you presume that all the fat people in here who like being fat don't move their body or don't care about health or don't eat a variety of food, or is that your presumption? And he was kind of like, well, yeah. And I was like, well, that's not actually the reality. And getting into healthism, the fat people who didn't like being fat were so focused on this idea of getting to this healthy status that losing weight would get them to this holy place, this place where people would love and accept them because they realized that they were a bad fatty and they were doing something about it, versus us fat people who apparently didn't care about health and in fact wanted to be unhealthy or something. And looking at the idea of health, what is health? Like, it's very hard to define, and looking at the definition of health being free from disease. From the moment that we're born, we're dying, basically, which is a very cheery thing, but our bodies are all breaking down. Something that got me really thinking about this is I went to the doctor and I had like this checkup, and my doctor was like, you're absolutely healthy. Your blood pressure and your bloods and everything, you are healthy. And I was like, cool. And then she handed me my prescription. And on my prescription is all of the medicine that I need to take for my long-term conditions. And so for my asthma, my eczema, my depression, my IBS, my hypothyroidism, like a long list of different things. And so it was a really interesting moment of, you are healthy, but here are the things that you need to take because you are unhealthy. And it really started getting me to think about, what is health? And why is it that we so aggressively pursue this thing, which is made up? This idea of health is something that we have just manufactured because it's not a final destination. We can't just arrive at being healthy. And even if we could arrive at this destination of being healthy, that is going to be a temporary thing because unfortunately we will die. And if we are basing human worth on health, then that's all kinds of fucked up. And we already do that. And we do that a lot with fat people being like, oh, they're fat, but at least they're healthy. Oh, they're fat, but at least they work out. And oh, they're fat, but their blood pressure is fine or whatever it is, it doesn't mean that that person is better or worse than someone who isn't as healthy, whatever health is, or someone who doesn't necessarily want to spend their life pursuing a certain health status. So if you're doing a Netflix marathon or if you're doing the London marathon, you're still morally equivalent. Both of those things are morally equivalent activities. Oh, so that's my rant on healthism.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I love that saying. Reagan Chastain says something similar too, like running a marathon or having a Netflix marathon are morally equivalent. And it's so interesting. And I'm so struck by that experience you had at the doctor, because I have a very similar situation. I have, a number of chronic health conditions that you mentioned, and I have to manage them long term and take medication and all of this stuff. And also, I'm considered quote unquote healthy. And I think that fat phobia and thin privilege probably play a role in that as well, where doctors look at me and think I'm healthy because my body size fits what they think of as quote unquote healthy, at least for the vast majority of doctors in Western cultures. They're sort of seeing things through that lens. But it's so interesting to have there's certain health conditions over here that you can have long-term and chronic, but be considered healthy. And then there's these other things like high blood pressure, cholesterol, or diabetes or something like that, where I think our culture is much more likely to label those as unhealthy. And, you're an unhealthy person if you have those. And really what the difference is fat phobia. It's like those are considered the fat people's diseases, even though that's bullshit and they're not, because everybody gets those conditions. It doesn't, matter what size your body is, but there's this sort of moral imperative placed on avoiding these certain conditions. And if you have these other conditions, you might be chronically ill. And if you're having a flare-up of them, then you're suddenly not healthy. But if you have them and you're managing them long-term through medication, and, if you stop the medication, you have a problem again. It's like somehow that's considered okay, and that our culture kind of gives that a pass.
Yeah. And as well, the idea of, some things being fat people problems, the idea that if we have something else going on, so I mentioned about my hypothyroidism, a hypo where it's broken. Anyway, it's broken.
Yeah, that's the one I have too. Low. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I got that diagnosis, my doctor said to me, listen, you're going to be so happy about what I'm going to tell you. And she said, your thyroid is broken. And I was like, bitch, what the fuck would I be happy about that? And she's like, this is not an excuse for you to be fat. And I was thinking, she's like, every woman that gets told this, she thinks that that's the reason that they're fat. And I was just like, I was so angry. I was just like, fuck you, bitch. Anyway, when we were on the show, we had a geneticist come in and they took our DNA previously, looking at the genes that affect the predisposition of someone to have a higher body weight. And I let them take my DNA, but I didn't want to know the results. And the reason why I didn't want to know the results is that it doesn't matter why I am fat. There is no reason that makes it good or bad. And so tying that with, if I happen to have type 2 diabetes, does that make me a bad person versus if I have another condition, like you mentioned before, that makes me a worse person? Like, we're categorizing conditions and illnesses as this one's a good one to have. And I have hypothyroidism, then I'm a good fatty because then I've got a reason to be fat. But then if I have type 2 diabetes, then I caused it because I'm fat. But then we forget about, if I have this quote unquote excuse to be fat because my genes are saying that I'm predisposed to being fat. And it's just ridiculous. It's redonkulous. And, we see that in the sexual health world, certain STIs and STDs having certain stigma about it. And it's like they're all equal. None is quote unquote better or worse, even though it could be more difficult to deal with or less difficult. But still, the person who has anything that's going on with their body, everything is equal, is morally equivalent. So if you're fat and you have type 2 diabetes, it's fine. And if you have anything else going on or you don't, it doesn't mean you're better or worse than the next person sat next to you.
Oh, amen to that. Yeah, I feel like it really is so insidious this way that fat phobia has morphed and shapeshifted now, because there are people out there, I think, who would even say, like, I don't really care about my weight. I don't care about how I look. In fact, I get questions from people like this often where it's like, I literally don't care how I look. It's not about what society thinks about me. It's that I want to be healthy. But then when you kind of scratch the surface of that, it's like, really though, is it not at all related to what society thinks? Because our society does stigmatize certain diseases disproportionately because of fat phobia.
Absolutely. This stuff is so juicy, isn't it? Learning about healthism and how we're so, exactly what you said. People who come to me, that is their fear, is I'm okay being fat, but I don't want to be healthy. And it is just so, there's so many layers behind that of exactly what you said, fat phobia, of why is it you think that fat people can't be healthy, and why is health such a driving force? And of course, we all want to live for as long as possible. Not of course, but generally we want to be happy and be comfortable in our bodies. But is that really what's going on? Or are you terrified that you might have a diagnosis that will make people say, I told you if you didn't lose weight, then this would happen. And I think a lot of people are scared to get to that point where something like that happens, because they don't want people to say, I told you so, you're so greedy and horrible and we all hate you.
Ugh, I know. I think a lot of people live in fear of that, because there is that sort of good fatty thing of like, okay, as long as your blood work is okay, as long as you're healthy, right? The sort of bullshit body positivity that, circulates out there, where it's like, actually, no, that's not really body positivity or liberation or fat positivity. That's conditional, just expanding the definition of what's acceptable by a tiny margin.
Yeah. And that's the biggest thing I get from trolls is, but what about their health? You're killing people by saying that it's okay to be fat. And it's always about their health. And we need to stop focusing so heavily on health. And people are like, but why? It's good to be healthy. Well, because by focusing so much on health, we are damaging our health. We are damaging our mental health. We're damaging our well-being, because we're so focused on these certain outcomes, which most of the time we have no control over, but we can have control over the way that we are thinking about ourselves, the way that society talks about health, and the amount we obsess over trying to get to this healthy status.
Yeah, because prioritizing the physical above everything else really does skew our overall health. It damages it by, mental health is such an important aspect of overall well-being. It's very important, and it drives a lot of physical health outcomes. So if we're obsessing and freaking out and eating in a disordered way and over-exercising and doing other things that are damaging our mental health and our physical health too, it's going to harm our overall well-being a whole lot more than accepting ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I say when trolls are saying, but what about the health? You're killing everyone. I know they don't give a fucking shit about my health or the health of any fat person, because if they did, they wouldn't be on the internet saying, but what about your health? Because they would know that they're damaging my health in the very, moment that they're typing that out on their phone, damaging my mental health and other people's mental health who are reading those comments. Or even, if it's not coming from trolls, it's just coming from, Aunt Karen across the dinner table or whoever. They don't give a shit about your health. They care about upholding their own fatphobic bullshit.
Yeah, because if they did care about your health, like you said, they would not be weight stigmatizing you, because we know that weight stigma has negative effects on people's overall health. Like, weight stigma is a bigger risk factor to health than what you eat. So sorry, trolls, if you're telling people that they need to eat differently because it's going to harm their health if they don't. That's actually not true. It's the weight stigma that you're enacting on people that's the harm. And, weight stigma has been shown to increase cortisol, as I said earlier. Like, it literally increases stress in the body, which puts people at greater risk of heart disease, diabetes, some forms of cancer, early mortality. Like, it's not good for you. Weight stigma is not good for you. And people who are able to overcome that and be, not that you ever fully overcome it in diet culture, but people who are able to learn to be resilient to that actually are much better off, actually have much better health outcomes down the line.
Mm-hmm. Amen. And when you say this to trolls, they're like, but I'm just trying to motivate you. And as we know, shame is such a terrible motivator and has the opposite effect. And so it's just basically, they just want to be knobs. They just want to be massive knobs.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, when we can call them out on their bullshit and say, nah, not working today, go away.
Well, I think also people get into that place of opposing everything that the science actually says about weight stigma and being like, no, it's just wrong. It's just wrong to be fat. You have to lose weight in order to be healthy. Like plugging their ears, la, 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 I can't hear you, la, la, la. Like, anything that we say in defense of a weight inclusive approach kind of just rolls off because they're so stuck in what they believe. But I think a part of that too is that they've benefited from, or even perceive themselves to have benefited from, losing weight and eating a certain restricted way and exercising in a certain compulsive way. And, they think that they've, in some cases maybe have, but in some cases actually are doing that. And, if they stop doing it, would maintain relatively the same body size, because that is also a thing. People trick themselves into thinking that everything they're doing is the only reason that they're thin, instead of recognizing actually it has a lot to do with genetics and other circumstances that are not within your control.
And if only fat people could just do what they've done, then they can magically become thin like them. And that's why it's important that we have voices like yours. So people who have more privilege in their body size, because you're more likely to get through to someone who is a troll, because trolls a lot of times see fat people as, wanting to be the victim and saying, if we say stop weight stigma, they just see fat people as just being like, no, leave me and stop being mean to me. I just want to be fat and, eat all the food or whatever. But then when someone else has size privilege, it's more likely to get through to those people because they are like, oh, well, you're not trying to defend yourself because you're so fat and horrible. And they're more able to look at the science. But like you say, still a lot of people are fingers in the ears being like, no, it's terrible being fat.
And I feel like, it sucks that some people will listen to me more than they'll listen to a fat person because of the privilege that I have in my body. And that's where we are right now in the culture. And that is horrible. I wish it weren't that way. And I feel like if people can come in through the door of my work and start to listen to people like you and all the amazing other fat activists out there that are doing this work and spreading this message, then eventually, hopefully, they can start to come over to following all these people who are doing these amazing things in non-privileged bodies and bodies that are more marginalized than mine, and start to really expand their view as a result of that. Because unfortunately, I think for a lot of people who just come into this work, especially if they're coming in through their own efforts at eating disorder recovery or diet culture recovery, they're not necessarily thinking about social justice, and they're not necessarily thinking about needing to listen to a diversity of viewpoints. They're thinking about who has the most quote unquote authority that I can trust, who's the most science-based, who has the most letters after their name. I'm going to gravitate towards those folks. And so that often means anti-diet dietitians like me, or anti-diet therapists like a lot of my colleagues and friends, or anti-diet doctors, of whom there are 3 that I can count that I know anyway. People will often come in through that door because I think it's the easiest when first coming out of diet culture. But it can't stop there. You can't stop with just listening to people who look like me. That's not, it's not enough.
It's very hard when you are so deeply fat phobic, so deeply in diet culture, to look at a fat person who's saying it's okay to be fat. Science says that diets harm us and don't work and all that type of stuff. That's very, very difficult and very scary. And especially the size of the fat person, if it's a super fat person, it's even harder, because if you are so burdened with internalized fat phobia, weight stigma, it's terrifying, the idea that what if I stop dieting and I start trying to like my body, I might end up like them. a very fat person, versus because of their fat phobia, they can look at someone who has a smaller body and think there is hope still that I could become thin if I start intuitive eating and all that type of stuff. And then through your work, you can teach them, oh, hey, that's not the way to be. But it's easier for them to accept and learn from someone who has a body type that they might want to move towards because of their deep down still desire to be a smaller person or to be a thin person or whatever. And like you say, then it's kind of like understanding it's all about social justice and realizing, oh, well, let's learn it from fat people and from other marginalized identities, and that's great. But it's still important for a diverse range of people. And I think about, from my point of view, as a fat person, the first time I got introduced to this stuff, the first book that I read was Health at Every Size by Lindo Bacon. Now, if Lindo was a super fat person, would I have picked up the book? Would I have listened as much? Would I have let my fat phobia say something like, well, they're just making excuses for being fat, versus, this is science. They've got no reason to be need to say this stuff, versus, apart from their own life experience. And so I think it's really important.
Yeah, that's such a great point too, because, again, it's like the door into this work. And now you are doing this work as a fat activist yourself, and like bringing your perspective to the table and amplifying the voices of other fat activists that you probably wouldn't have looked twice at when you first were coming out of diet culture, when you first did hold on to that hope that, oh, maybe this will make me thin.
Yeah, because a lot of times you go into intuitive eating, you're like, oh, who knows what it's going to do to my weight? Or maybe I'm going to become, maybe my natural set point weight is, a tiny weight, and all that type of stuff. And if I had seen a super fat activist being like, it's okay to be fat, I would have been like, hell no, I don't think so. You're so unhealthy, and all the other bullshit fat phobia that I held.
Yeah, I sometimes think that, for some people anyway, if you are already able to like hear that message from a super fat activist, maybe with other marginalized identities as well, then you probably would already be really far along. Like you probably wouldn't need actually as much of the work breaking down internalized diet culture beliefs. If you're at the point when you can actually hear that message and have it land coming from someone with such marginalized identities. And that sucks. Like that's not how it should be, but that is how it is right now, because fat phobia is the norm in our culture. And that's what we all that's like the muck we all have to claw our ways out of and rise up from.
Yeah, and it's a good indicator of your own internalized fat phobia. And we all have, fat phobic beliefs, and, maybe yours and mine are so deep down we haven't yet uncovered the final layers of our own fat phobia. But if you realize that you're gravitating more towards someone who has more privilege in their body and respecting their voice more versus someone who has more marginalized identities, and then that's a very helpful way for you to realize, I've got some bullshit in my head that I need to work on.
Yeah, I think similarly when you recognize that you're listening to people, like I have a lot of podcast listeners who say, I'm now like following everyone you've had on and like devouring their work and stuff like that. I'm like, okay, that's a good sign for you, that you're in that place now. That's awesome.
Yes. Yay for spreading all the love. Yes.
Yeah,
awesome.
No, totally. And yeah, such an important thing for us to all work together in this process, because I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do without the amazing fat activists that came before me and started the Health at Every Size movement, and the founders of intuitive eating who have been so amazing at getting hooked into Health at Every Size and fat activism and are so on board with that, having done this work for 25 years, like we all have a role to play.
Yeah. And as well, on the other side of things is how all of us have a different voice and have different things that we like to talk about in different styles. So someone might listen to me and be like, oh my God, I fucking hate her, and will never learn anything from me because they don't like me. And that's absolutely fine. And so someone else might be a better fit for them. And so there's no one perfect voice for any of this stuff. And it's who you resonate with and who you really can learn the most from.
Yeah, totally. We all have our different perspectives, our different strengths, our different ways of speaking to these issues. I love your voice, by the way. So I can't imagine anyone hating you and not wanting to hear what you had to say, both like your literal voice and your content. Like all of it is so amazing.
I noticed I got a podcast review and it was like a 2-star, and the review was like, she's so arrogant. Something like, I don't like her voice or something like that. But they gave me 2 stars. I was like, oh, thanks. They could have given me 1. And they said decent production values, but she's so arrogant. I was like, that's fine if you want to believe that I'm arrogant because I have high self-esteem or whatever it is.
Very hard one too, by the way. Like you fought tooth and nail to get that high self-esteem. So
Yeah. And it doesn't really mean anything about me. It's just something about them. And obviously they find it difficult to hear someone who is not, oh, I'm so horrible because I'm fat, and that's jarring for some people when a fat person is like, I'm fucking amazing, deal with it.
We so need more of that. Like it's
right.
Because I think it's so not the norm right now, and it's not what people are used to experiencing. They're used to that whole like, oh, I know I'm fat, I'm sorry, but I'm trying, and I'm doing the gym and eating not enough food, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard when you see someone who you perceive to be less than you, living life, being happy, not giving a fuck, and you're over here with a less marginalized body or a body that you perceive to be better, and you're busy dieting and doing all the things to try and get higher self-esteem, and they've just got it and they're still fat, then that's maddening. That's really difficult for some people to see.
Yeah, it's like it feels like it negates all their work that they put into achieving and grabbing that brass ring when it's like, it wasn't really a thing to grab, you kind of just had these privileges either inherent, or I definitely think some of the people who resist this idea most, and I have a lot of compassion for it, are the people who like started out fat, ended up losing weight, and, are that tiny like 2% of the people who are somehow able to maintain weight loss long term, and are like, oftentimes it gets harder and harder and harder as the years go by. So they're really like disordered in their eating and grabbing on for dear life to this weight loss that they fought so hard for, and where weight stigma maybe was their reality before. I really have compassion for people in that place. And I feel like they're some of the most angry when they hear this message because it is so counter to everything they feel they've worked for.
Yeah, it's like they've climbed Mount Everest, reaching this pot of gold at the top, and someone's at the bottom, like with another pot of gold, being like, "Oh, it's down here all the time, and you didn't need to do that. That you'd want to go and kick someone in the face if that was your reality, right? And be like, fuck you, I've worked so hard to get here." And yeah, so.
Yeah, I feel like that's so understandable. And it's like, I've definitely seen people who are in that boat come over to the side of self-acceptance and body liberation. And it's fucking amazing when that happens. Because I think to give up all that work that you did and to recognize like, this is actually not serving me and it's something I need to let go of. And I can accept myself no matter what happens to the size and shape of my body. I mean, that is a feat. That is a feat even greater than the one you exercise to get, to the place of losing weight and keeping it off.
And it's a real testament to their character and their personality that they're able to do that, because it's so painful to realize that you've wasted so much of your time, effort, money, energy, all that type of stuff. And then to turn around and be like, oh shit, I was wrong. Or maybe I could have done it easier or whatever. So they're cool people. They're cool people. If you're one of those people, high five to you.
Yes, seriously. Major high fives, because that is hard work. And I mean, same with the people who are like dietitians and therapists and doctors who are engaged in the weight normative model and like making tons of money with it, and maybe, had their own difficult relationship with food and disordered eating as well. The folks who can be in that boat of like having a livelihood based on shrinking bodies and deciding to go the other way and to go a route that is helping people avoid harm and actually take care of themselves is also massive and cool.
It's kind of like I've been watching videos, the Westboro Baptist Church, and they have some defectors, and I think her name's Megan Phelps, something Phelps. Anyway, and now she talks about how she was so wrong, and I think it gives, when you've turned your back on that type of thing, it's so hard, it's so scary, but also it gives you a wonderfully unique perspective, so you're able to help other people who are in the same position as you used to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm grateful for those people to, help reach out to the folks that, again, sometimes people can't hear it. Like, that's an area where I think some people can't hear it from me, is more with, the people who've had weight stigma, who've been in, fat body and lost weight. And they're like, you can't possibly know what it's like. That's true. I know from my friends and colleagues in this movement who've told me, and I have empathy for that, but I don't have that lived experience. I don't know what it's like personally. So for someone who has been there and who can do that work of like, I do know what it's like, I have been there personally, and let me help you to the other side is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yay for people.
Yay for people.
Back to diet people.
Yay for all of the anti-diet movement. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, tell us more about where people can find your work online and learn more about you. And I know you kind of recently, or since the last time we spoke for the podcast anyway, you've rebranded. So curious to hear about Fierce Fatty and everything you're doing there.
Yeah, so in the last episode that we recorded, I was Bam Pow Life, and I was like, that never really was a perfect brand for me. And then I wrote my book, Fierce Fatty, and I was like, motherfucker, that should be my name. And so I totally rebranded everything maybe 18 months ago. And so you can find me on everywhere on the internet as Fierce Fatty. My website is Fierce Fatty. My podcast is, surprise, surprise, Fierce Fatty. And if you come onto my website, you can check out my TEDx talk and find my book and videos and my podcast and everything. And come look at the pictures of me, and yeah, it's amazing.
It's amazing. Your pictures are so great. Your work is so great. I love everything you're doing. So we'll be sure to link to all that in the show notes so people can find you. And thank you so much for coming back on the show. It was a delight to talk with you as always.
Thank you so much.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Victoria Welsby for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening to the last new episode of the season. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the places to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. You can also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which is another way to help new listeners discover us and is always so appreciated. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/249. That's christyharrison.com/249. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to make peace with food, break free from diet culture, and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, and this episode's Ask Food Psych co-host, Vincci Tsui, our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasek, and our transcriptionist, Mycroft Holmes, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. It takes a village. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. And I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.